In the previous chapter, we learned that Israel wanted a king so that they could be like the other nations. They selected Saul, a man of standing, impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Unfortunately for the people of Israel, Saul didn't align his life and reign to the upper story of God. His disobedience sent a very contradictory message about the nature and character of the God of Israel. Instead of the surrounding nations seeing God as holy, just, loving, full of grace, through Saul's leadership, they saw him as cruel and greedy. And God communicated to the prophet Samuel that it was time to find another king, one who would represent God's heart and God's passion. Samuel was sent to the house of Jesse from Bethlehem, and one of Jesse's sons would become the next king of Israel. Samuel filled his horn with oil and left for what appeared to be a fairly straightforward assignment. When Samuel arrives, Jesse lines up his 7 sons from the oldest to the youngest, and Samuel goes through the lineup, but he doesn't anoint any of them as the next king of Israel. Samuel, perplexed, asks, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse admitted he had an 8th son named David, but didn't think to bring him off the field from tending the sheep because he couldn't see him as even a possibility. The Hebrew word Jesse uses to describe his youngest son is our English word runt. David was the runt of the litter. David came in from the field to meet the famous prophet, and before he knew it, oil poured down his head. David would be the next king of Israel. Now, at that time, David was a mere 16 years old. And there's a difference between being anointed as king and being inaugurated as king. David was the pick of God, but he would have to wait for a date in the future to actually become the king. However, we are told from the time that David was anointed with oil that the Lord was with him. And that's a big deal. With God working through young David, he finds himself saving Israel by taking out a 9-foot Philistine giant named Goliath. We find him joining Saul's army and being so effective as a warrior that the people begin to cheer David's success over Saul's. And Saul gets jealous, and he seeks to remove David, to actually kill him. And for the next 14 years, Saul tracks David down as a fugitive. David has many low moments in those 14 years where he wants to give up, but in the end, he grows and he learns to trust in God. He records his deepest thoughts in the Psalms. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. I can count all of my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothes. In the lower story, David felt like a failure. But this is not how God saw him from the upper story. From God's seat, he saw a different kind of David than his father, his brothers, King Saul, Goliath, and even David himself. When Samuel saw Jesse's older son, he thought he looked like a king on the outside. God interrupted Samuel with this comment of correction. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David might have been considered a runt by his father on the outside, but God examined his heart on the inside and beheld a giant. You know, frequently a person puts on a show when they're in public to win the approval of people or to portray an image not exactly accurate of who they really are. God, however, peers at our actions when no one else is looking. When David was out all alone in the hills, shepherding his dad's small flock of smelly sheep, God observed him. What God viewed day after day caused him to select this young man as the next king of Israel. The integrity in David's heart manifested itself when no one was looking, and it caught God's attention. Listen to Psalm 78. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands he led them. You see, Israel needed a king who had a heart overflowing with integrity. This kind of king would reflect the nature and character of God and cause not only the Israelites, but the surrounding nations to want to follow this God. So if David is God's number one pick, why did he allow King Saul to stay in office and chase David around the world for 14 years? The answer is simple: to grow David up so he could handle the pressures of shepherding an entire nation. You see, it's one thing to shepherd a small flock of sheep. It's another level altogether to shepherd a nation. Essentially, God put David through a spiritual boot camp to refine him into the kind of man who would truly trust in God. Now, it's interesting to note that on several occasions, Saul had a change of heart and wanted to make peace with David. However, God didn't allow it. We're told it was God who hardened Saul's heart toward David. And at some point in Saul's reign, his continual pattern of disobedience crossed the line. And God looked into his heart the same way he did with David's, and he saw a lack of integrity. Saul's new mission in life became to leverage his jealousy and his lack of integrity to equip David to handle disappointment and to trust in God. Let this be a reminder to us that God can use our disobedient lives as effectively as he uses our obedient lives in the lower story to work out his upper story plan. However, we will miss out on the rich blessing that comes to those who follow God's will. 14 years later, David became the king of Israel, and a good king he was. Later in the story, we're given this assessment of David's reign. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life. A number of years ago, a Christian artist sang a song about David that went like this: "When others see a shepherd boy, God may see a king." There's more going on in David's story that points us to God's upper story plan to get us all back. David was referred to as God's anointed one. Those two words in English, in our English language, is the Hebrew word Messiah. David was the Messiah in the lower story. His righteous reign pointed us to the Messiah in the upper story. God is looking for more Davids today. We too, like David, can point people toward the one true Messiah.